So for some introductions, we're going to start off with Richard and for himself.
I wish I could look that good as that photo. That's what I wish. Everyone, so Richard Brynteson. I am located here in Minneapolis. I see some familiar names in the list. So I have been working in Link, well, OCS, then Link, then Skype, now Teams, for a long time. And every 2 months, I also run the bi-monthly, Skype/Team. So, and as we go along, if you have questions, for sure, put them in the chat. Come off mute. Try to make this a little interactive. Otherwise, it just feels like we're screaming at a computer screen the entire time, which isn't the most fun. Eric?
Awesome. So I am Eric Marsi. I'm from Barberton, Ohio, and I work for the same company that Richard does at T2M. This past year, I did graduate from the University of Akron and have quite a little bit of a list of certifications, not many. Overall, light IT has been a passion hobby for me since I've been a little kid. Kindergarten, I wanted a server rack. Just kind of put that in perspective. Some of the things I like doing as a hobby, I enjoy tinkering with things, figuring out how something works. Love building electronics, and then winter season comes around. Skiing is a big time must, and then throughout the rest of the year, four-wheeling is kind of my other hobby.
We should have had a contest, guess Eric's age. Should have had that as a game. Darn it. Things to think about next time.
In chat, type in how old you guys think I am.
All right, let's go.
There we go. So we're going to go ahead and start off with some Teams voice features. And first, before we hop into the actual feature set itself, we need to first discover why our organization's moving to Microsoft Teams for voice. So Teams in general is a all-in-one collaboration tool that allows you to have your chat, your meetings, your team information interface, and really is designed for the remote workforce in your organization. So, with COVID in this past year, a lot of organizations are now moving to users working remote. And what's nice about Teams is that it provides a way for you to collaborate, but using a brand new tool set that's all in one, and kind of, again, going back to that single pane of glass mindset. Another big thing with Teams is that it does reduce cost in the organization. Instead of bringing people into, you had Skype for Business server, for example, you're now pushing people out of your network. So there's less security, there's less infrastructure you're not having to deal with, requiring multiple servers, Microsoft licensing for all those servers, for all the different services and applications. So it's really kind of consolidating all that down. You're removing the amount of cost that you needed previously, consolidating all your contracts, and just kind of really bringing that modern tool set to your organization. So what type of features do you expect to see from Microsoft Teams for voice? So originally at launch, Microsoft Teams offered things such as call parts, shared line appearances, busy media bypass, a lot of different features that they brought extended since launch. Now this year alone, they brought on a lot more features, such as dynamic E911 for calling plans, dynamic E911 for direct routing. And we'll kind of get into what calling plans versus direct routing is here in a couple slides. Music on hold, a lot of different features that they brought to the Teams client. Now, in the future, what is Microsoft planning to kind of expand on their existing investment with Microsoft? Some of the call queues updates, contact center integrations. So if anybody's kind of been seeing some of the news recently, Matt Landis and his team just went ahead and became the first fully native certified contact center for Microsoft Teams. So I expect more organizations to follow in the future. If you have already seen some contact centers for Microsoft Teams, do keep in mind that that's not a native solution. The only real native one today is currently the Landis Contact Center. And then also channel calling coming in the future. Now, that is more or less the system features, but what does the user have as a feature Microsoft Teams for voice? So you have both support for a physical and a soft phone. So a soft phone is more or less your Teams client on your desktop computer, and you would be using a headset or some type of earphones or earpiece to communicate with that. But then the physical phone is your traditional desk phone. Now, there are two options that we will talk about later when we get into our endpoints, and that is native versus 3-pip, and kind of what is the difference between those two device sets. Also, you have features such as call park, hold and transfer, busy on busy, call ID. A lot of standard things that you would see with the traditional phone system is available today in Microsoft Teams. And one of the actual.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry. I was going to say, before you roll from this slide, that there are just two items I do want to call out real quick, especially for people coming from a Skype for Business environment. So when you see shared line appearance, don't be confused as though that's the same type of shared line appearance as you had in Skype for Business. It's a very different type of feature set. They just happen to share the same name to add a little more confusion in life. And the other feature I always like to call out, because it wasn't available in Skype for Business, might have been feature every single organization I walked into, and it's so simple: call blocking. To be able to go in and block a call so you don't get those spam calls anymore. So I always like to just pull those two out in particular.
Yep. Thank you, Richard. So kind of moving on from some of the system features, we can now look at some of the system features. What do you see from a admin perspective into the Teams phone system? So we're going to kind of talk about this again in future slides, calling plans versus direct routing, pros and cons of each and what they provide for your organization. But from a systemic side, you can see configuration, auto attendance, cloud call queues, you can configure your hold music, you can change your outbound or even block the outbound caller ID. There's a lot of features that are available to you as an admin based on the other features that we did talk about already with Microsoft Teams. So moving into Teams calling, we can kind of go ahead and talk about how does Teams work as a phone system and kind of the infrastructure behind it, and kind of move into how it can benefit your organization. I'll kind of let Richard kind of start going into these two here.
Yep. So from a Teams calling perspective, and it's kind of important to understand, Microsoft has Microsoft Teams, right? We're all using it today. That's how we, chatting, taking messages, all that stuff. They also have a feature called phone system, and really think of the phone system as your PBX. So you might be using a Mitel or a Cisco or some other PBX. So phone system separate from Microsoft Teams, and that requires licensing. But then also you need some way to connect your PBX phone to the actual PSTN, or how do I make a phone call itself? How do I receive a phone call? And that's where direct routing or Microsoft calling plans come into play. So you really need all three pieces in order to make that telephone call. The top two are licenses. The bottom one can be a license, or it can be done via direct routing in a different service. And we'll go into each one of those and how those impact your organization.
So starting out with our calling plans, and calling plans in a way is Microsoft becoming your PSTN provider in your organization. So it's Microsoft provided SIP trunks that you have to actually port your over to the owner of your DIDs in your organization. If you do want to, you can just purchase those DIDs from Microsoft if you're setting up like potentially a new organization. But in most cases, you are going to be porting those numbers over to Microsoft. And again, that is fully managed by Microsoft. So there is nothing you have to worry about in terms of PSTN connectivity or anything else. Microsoft manages that all for you. Now, in order to actually utilize the calling plans, you have to have the phone system license, which is what enables the phone system features in your Office 365 tenant, such as auto attendance, call queues, etc. So if you already are using E5s in your organization for all of your users, you can use those E5s today, and there's nothing else you have to purchase for phone system. But if you do want to use calling plans, you just add in the calling plan license per user that wants to use phone system, and you're good to go. Now, if you are using an E1 or an E3, it is an $8 add-on license to that base license. And then if you do want dial-in audio conferencing in addition for those E1, E3 users, you will have to spend another $4. Now, if you're running the math there, just the dial-in conferencing piece and the phone system piece would bring the total user a month cost to $32 a month. For $3 more, you can get an E5 and get a lot more feature sets. So depending on the needs of your organization, it may just be more beneficial to go with that E5 versus an E1, E3, and kind of start adding all these additional bills and more invoices you have to track every month. Now, with calling plans, right now there are limitations in terms of what countries it is. So it was 10 countries, but they did just add 6 more into that list. In the US or any of those countries listed there, you can go ahead and utilize the service. Now, there are 2 different calling plans available, and one is the domestic calling plan, and the other one is the domestic and international calling plan. So if you are using just the domestic calling plan, that user is going to get allotted 3,000 minutes a month of call credits in a way. So if you have 10 users and each user is getting 3,000, that gets pooled together in general. So, let's say you have 2 users and each one has 3,000 minutes. If one uses 5,000 minutes, the other one only uses 1,000 minutes, you're still within reason. But that moment that other user wants to try to go to 1,001 minutes, you're not going to have the amount of minutes available to you with that calling plan. Now, with the international calling plan, you still get that 3,000 domestic minute a month list, but you also get 1,200 international minutes. So that's for calls outside of the U.S. Now, if you are a nonprofit organization and you do want to utilize calling plans, but you don't want to have to pay for the full 3,000 minute a month amount of licensing, there are smaller license tiers that are available for those nonprofit organizations. So if your tenant is configured as a nonprofit, you will see those options available, so it could save your organization quite a bit of money. Now, the other option for PSTN connectivity that we talked about is where you use direct routing. So direct routing allows you to be the PSTN provider in a way with your organization. So perhaps maybe you had an existing on-premises Skype for Business, Avaya, Mitel, Short, any of those phone systems on premises. And let's say you signed a 3-year contract with your telco provider that you want to utilize that phone service with Microsoft Teams, and you don't want to have to worry about canceling that contract and any of the fees tied to that. You can connect that SIP trunk right into a certified Microsoft Teams SBC, and that SBC will then route that call to Microsoft's phone system in the cloud, and then you can tie that to a Teams user. With this, there are some requirements. SSL certificate is something you have to worry about, but other than that, that is pretty much the basic basis to getting Microsoft Teams direct routing set up with your on-premises SBC. One of the big things with this also is that this allows you to do third-party integrations with Microsoft Teams. So perhaps maybe you might have some type of generic SIP device that you want to utilize with Microsoft Teams, but that can't register directly to Microsoft Teams. You can tie that into that SBC directly. Now, if in the future, Microsoft is planning on bringing direct SIP registration to Microsoft Teams, to our yield to Microsoft Teams in the future. But for right now, today, if you want to get your organization going with those legacy devices, you would still need that SBC and that direct route to Microsoft Teams.
All right, so let's take a second here because there's a couple of things that Eric talked about that I think are important for the group, and there's a couple of questions I want to answer as well. So when we look at that session border controller, that's going to sit somewhere in your perimeter network, and most likely it's going to have 2 legs. One leg is going to go out with a public IP, and that other leg will come inside of your organization. So we do have a slide in a couple where you'll see where we actually add an SBC, your own PBX in there, so you can kind of see what that flow would look like. But keep in mind that SBC is going to kind of be 2-legged in your environment. So there's that you have to think about when that configuration is set up. The good news is configuring the session border controller for this is really, really easy in order to do that. So, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a couple of slides as well. So there was a couple of questions I did want to answer. Lori asked, what happens? So if I had my, your example, your 10 users with 3,000 minutes, and I exceeded my 30,000 minutes. What happens to the user experience when they try to make that next phone call? They've ran out of credits. There's a couple of options, actually. So one, Microsoft does have what they call communication credits. Basically, lets it kind of overflow. So if you exceed your allotment, they kind of dip into this communications credit and pull time out from that so that you don't like get a fast busy signal. You can even, this isn't like in the docs anywhere, if you go over your communications credit, the users are going to keep kind of working for a little bit. If you really exceed it, right, then you will start running into a fast, busy kind of experience. So I have personally never seen an organization hit that 3,000 minute mark ever, right? Because if you just think about the sheer number of users potentially in your organization, if I've got, 100 users and they all have 3,000 minutes apiece and they're pooled together, there's no way all 100 of those users are probably going to use that in a single month. So you just kind of end up, it becomes a math game, but I've personally never seen that from that perspective. Matt asks, oh, okay. So Matt's asking about some device questions. I'm going to hold that one, Matt, just towards the end. And we can talk about some of the devices because there's a lot of really good devices that come in there as well. So, all right.
Okay. So kind of touching base on what Richard and I just discussed about direct routing. Direct routing really is bringing your own carrier to teams, whether it's an on-premises, like a PSTN, an actual, I can't think of the word right now. I don't know. What's the word, Richard, for an actual on-premises?
PBX.
Like a PBX or like a physical hard phone line. I can't remember the name. I don't even know why.
Like actual twisted pair. Like you're gonna bring a, yeah, sure.
Yep. So you could bring those different things to Microsoft Teams if you do want to utilize that. But you could also just connect to it as a standard SIP provider in the cloud, such as like Amazon Chime Voice Connector or Twilio or something of that matter. So there are multiple deployment methods for direct routing. And one of the big ones is that you could have a physical, audio codes or Sonos SBC in your on-premises environment, or even a cloud hosted SBC. So if your organization's wanting to save money, let's say you have 1,000 users, but you don't really want anything on premises, you can deploy that SBC into Azure or AWS and connect it up to your tenant and utilize your own SBC to save money as compared to Microsoft's calling plans. Now, another option you have is a carrier managed service. So this is more or less a SIP carrier, not even a SIP carrier, just a direct routing provider that's out there that routes across the internet. Now, that solution may provide limited interop with existing systems. So if you have like an Avaya on-prem, that carrier may or may not allow that integration with their SBC, since it is part of like more or less a shared system. Another way you can look at it is through a dedicated managed service. So that is more or less a carrier or somebody, a provider out there that will say, we will host your SBC for you, and we will manage your SBC, make sure everything works in your SBC, but it's still kind of in our environment. It's whether it's in their AWS and their type of data center, it's their SBC, but you're paying to utilize that SBC. But you don't have to worry about the management that comes with that SBC. And then again, the other option, kind of tying back to that physical SBC, is you can just run that SBC in-house virtually or with physical hardware. And as Richard did state before, do consider needing a public IP for that SBC and also that SSL requirement for that SBC. Now, why would you want to do direct routing over a Microsoft calling plan? One sounds very simple. You just have, you throw a license at a user, you're great. The big one is that you do have the support for global coverage. So as stated before, there are only 16 countries that support Microsoft calling plans. So if you're only supporting 16 countries, what happens to that 17th or 18th country that you need phone service in? Direct routing is your answer to get that service into Microsoft Teams. Additionally, as I discussed previously, if you have any type of existing carrier relationship or contract that you don't want to leave, you can use direct routing to get that in there. And then again, also that interop with existing systems such as like a PBX, paging systems, elevators, alarm system, fax machines, etc. Now, the other big one is that it could come down to cost. With Microsoft's own calling plans, it is $12 or $24 a user a month. And if you multiply that by 100 users, that does add up to a pretty hefty penny for all your users in your organization. Whereas potentially with a SIP provider, you're paying $1 a DID a month, and then you're paying potentially like 0.002 cents a minute for inbound, outbound calls to that carrier. So there'd be cost savings potentially by looking at that direct routing method to a certain degree. But if you're more or less like a 5-person shop, you don't really need much. It would just be easier at that point doing a Microsoft calling plan, because then you're not having to worry about any servers or SBCs in your environment. You're just kind of here, Microsoft, deal with it. So some considerations to kind of take into effect with this is that some service numbers to cover if there are direct routing issues. So potentially you might want to, if potentially BC on-premises environment, you could have like an alternate number in your organization that you can still dial in through Microsoft to still get somebody connecting that call internally. But you could also just have a calling plan just for testing some users, just to at least see what Microsoft Teams can bring to voice for you in your organization.
So there's two other things I always like to, and I never like to write these in a slide because I always feel bad when I say them, but I always want to mention them for organizations of why you might choose direct routing over Microsoft calling plans. The first is Microsoft, although they allow you to purchase phone numbers, they don't allow you to purchase phone numbers in a block of numbers. So a lot of organizations, I want to purchase this number, I want to have it between, the first number starts at 0001 and it's going to go through 0100, right? I need 100 numbers in numerical order. You can't do that through Microsoft directly. So you could purchase it through another provider and numbers. But the second reason that I always say that I'm kind of weary about porting my numbers to Microsoft is, well, now Microsoft has full control over those numbers. And that's not to say it's a bad thing necessarily, but it's possible that, Teams could suffer an outage of some sort, right? And if Teams suffered that outage, I'd have no means to remediate those calls. They're simply going to go to Office 365 and unfortunately die. So one of the great things with direct routing is you could set up configuration on the SBC. So my call comes into the SBC, and in the event that there's a failure, do something with it. So Eric, if you bounce to the next slide real quick, I think it's got yep. So here's a kind of a good example of what we were talking about in people with like different type of devices. So someone had mentioned, we have a Mitel, we're looking at this direct routing kind of scenario, right? How does that work? So in this picture, we've purchased our certified session border controller, our SBC. It's audio codes, it's ribbon, it's AnyNode, it's whomever is sitting there. And again, it could be hosted on premises, it could be hosted in the cloud, but you need that SBC somewhere in the organization. Well, now I can take that SBC and I can branch it off into two different directions. I could have a leg run across the internet into Office 365, but I could also have another leg run to my on-premises environment where I have my existing PBX. I have my existing, analog gateways or call center or anything like that. So when a call comes in, it's going to come through the PSTN network on the left. It's going to go to my session border controller, and I can then make a logical decision. Where do I want to send that phone call? Do I want to send it to an existing PBX? So is that destined for the PBX and I could just route the call there? Or I could route the call up to Office 365. So it gives you, when you have that SBC kind of in the middle playing, the traffic cop, it allows you to make a lot of really fun decisions of what to do with that call. But the other reason I like direct routing is, let's pretend, right, that internet connection is down. Maybe it's not Microsoft that's down. Maybe you've lost internet connection. Maybe whatever the case is, right? You don't have a means to reach out to Office 365 anymore. You could set the session border controller to fail back and do different tasks. If it sees the trunk is down, instead of trying to send the call down the trunk, reroute it to the PBX. Or if you see the trunk is down, reroute it to the user's cell phone number. So there's a lot of different options you have, flexibility, the moment you have that SBC in the environment. And that's kind of the beauty of this. The other piece that I always like to mention here is, your cost for direct routing is really low. So we talked about at the beginning, you still need a phone system license off to the side. Like that's a hard requirement with direct routing. So I'm going to pay the $8 a month if I'm an E3 user, or if I have an E5, it's already included. So I don't even have to worry about it. But I'm going to license and assign that to my end user in Office 365. My cost then for direct routing is just the cost of the management and the build of the SBC. So in my theoretical example you see on the screen here, that existing PBX, that Mitel that's sitting there, I could, for very little dollars, right, connect up my SBC to the internet, because I got to get a certificate and stuff like that. But again, these are like really small costs, and be able to live in a world where I'm kind of coexisting in both an on-premises PBX and also up in the cloud and using Teams. So it just gives you kind of that flexibility you would not normally have. Would I leave out anything?
I don't think you did.
Okay, cool.
Awesome. So and one of the topologies that we talked about earlier was having a hosting partner for your actual direct routing service. So one of the benefits of having a hosting provider is that you can actually just bring your own SIP trunk to that provider. So let's just say you're on premises today with the Mitel or a Avaya system, you want to move to Teams, you have that SIP trunk already, but you just want to say, hey, I want somebody else to deal with this. Here's the SIP trunk information. We want phone service in the Microsoft Teams. You can take that SIP trunk and tie it, have tie it to the hosting provider's environment, and then you can utilize their SBCs that they already have as part of their platform, and then tie that directly into your Office 365 tenant. Now, from a hosting provider's perspective, that hosting provider is going to deploy those SBCs as a virtual appliance. So it's no physical hardware that company is using. They're using those virtualized SBCs. And the nice thing with the hosting provider model is that you don't have to worry about managing or monitoring those SBCs, worrying about certificate requirements, because that hosting provider is going to go ahead and deal with that for you. The other one that Richard did talk about was that you do not have to port any of those numbers to Microsoft. So you have that control still over your DIDs, whether or not you're controlling that SBC or your hosting provider is controlling that SBC. Ultimately, it's still tied to your own personal account, and you can make routing decisions even at the carrier level in the event that Microsoft Teams were to go down. And a lot of times there is a certain scenario where it will often cost less than Microsoft's own calling plans. And I kind of talked about that a little bit ago with the small organizations. It might be beneficial just to deal with calling plans, but at a certain degree, doing that cost benefit analysis, you can determine whether or not what would be the better option for your organization. And then also with having more than just those 16 calling plan countries available to you, you have more options for international calling in your organization.
All right. So before we jump into 911,
yep.
Are there any questions about direct routing, how we would connect our phone to the PSTN to our phone system? Any questions in that realm? And you can put in the chat. You can come off mute. I don't care. This is always just kind of one of those good stopping points in the conversation. All right, I will take dead silence. Either they're all asleep or we've done such a great job. All right, awesome. Let's talk 911.
Okay. So with 911, you do have two options available to you, whether or not you're utilizing Microsoft's own calling plans or direct routing. And one of those is static configurations with your level. So a lot of carriers allow you to add a 911 address to a DID. So if that DID comes through and says, hey, we dialed 911, you can statically say at the carrier, this number, no matter what, is going to be at this address. Now that might be useful for, an organization that doesn't really have remote working users. Everybody's at one site, or it's like type of like a common area phone as an example. You can statically set that phone number. Now, that is with the calling plans, but then also you have dynamic configuration based on your network config. You might be wondering, what does that mean? Inside of the teams is you'll go ahead and give teams your entire network information. So you're going to say this subnet with this external IP is this location, this floor, and kind of map that out into a LIS database within Microsoft that says, here's exactly where each user is at. So potentially you may have like a 32-story building, and each floor has its own access point or a network switch that you can pretty much use to identify where that caller is at. And dynamically, based on where that user moves in that organization, we'll be able to, if they dial 911, it will be able to automatically tell exactly where that user is at within the organization. Now, we're talking about calling plans here, but we will kind of quickly, briefly talk about how that is done with direct routing. So starting with our static configuration, the phone numbers are just pretty much associated with an emergency address inside the Teams admin center. So pretty much you go into the Teams admin center, you set up an emergency address, and then you assign that to that user for that location, and that is a static 911 configuration. Not really much else to it. No matter what, when that user dials 911, that's their address. That's pretty basic. But when we talk about the dynamic configuration for 911, it is pretty much based on your network identifiers, such as your wireless access points, what specific subnet you're on, your external IP address. And then kind of coming in the future, they are going to add like network switch port level information. So this user is plugged into port 24 on switch 3 in the IDF1, or for example. They'll be able to get that visibility in the future into Microsoft Teams. For right now, we just have access point based on the switch, subnet, etc. Now, with this, and after building that database, if you are looking to use dynamic 911 services, you may want to also create emergency calling policies that allow you to notify whenever somebody dials 911. So, for example, if you go ahead and have some user at building 1 dial 911, you may want to let all the executive staff that's maybe at building 1, 2, and 3 all know this person just dialed 911. Here's their location. Here's the information about that. Now, when that happens, you can have multiple things happen. You could just have a chat sent out that says, here's this information, this person dialed 911 to all those people in that emergency calling policy. But you can also have a conference created automatically, or a mute conference created automatically that allows them to also listen in on that call to 911. I believe that's correct, right, Richard?
Okay. Yeah. Think of it as your security desk, right? So I've got a security desk. Someone's dialed 911. I want to notify the security desk that 911 call has happened. So they can either come into the call live or they can come in muted. There's also a really good question. What happens if someone's roaming, right? We're COVID this world. So maybe I've got all these things set up for all this really fancy dynamic configuration, but we're at home, we're at the shop, we're at the cabin, wherever the case is. It kind of depends on what you're dealing with. So if you're using a calling plan and I have dynamic configured, when that user goes to make the 911 call, it's not going to match any of the rules. It's not going to hit the port, the switch, the subnet, anything like that. So what Microsoft is going to do is they're going to route that 911 call into their national 911 calling center. So the end user is then going to get prompted and asked, what's your name? Where are you? Those kind of things. And once the 911 operator has that in the National Calling Center, they can then route that call to the appropriate PSAP so that the 911 gets to the right place. If you're doing direct routing and you have this scenario, this is something that direct routing individuals have to think about, right? And that's thank you for bringing the slide right up. So what you end up having to do is you have to think about, from a direct routing perspective, how do I want to handle that 911 call? Because obviously, if you just fired it out of your on-premises SBC, well, you're going to send 911, to the office and not to where the end user is. So with direct routing, you really have a couple of options. One, you could purchase your own 911 service, and there's a lot of services out there that offer specifically 911 purposes just for this. And how it works is when a user dials 911, instead of sending the call out the trunk to the PSTN, there'd be another SIP trunk on your SBC off to this other caller or to this other organization. So Red Sky is one of those organizations. So I dial 911. We're going to route the call out to Red Sky, and the information that was determined before is going to get sent with that SIP request, and it's going to go to Red Sky. And if Red Sky can figure out based on the SIP information where the end user is, great, we route 911 correctly. If they don't, well, Red Sky has their own national 911 service, so they will take that call and then they'll go ahead and route that to the right place. The important thing to know is that everyone handles it slightly differently. So like Red Sky will charge you X amount of dollars for however many calls have to be answered by that national call center. Microsoft simply eats those costs today, right? So each organization does its own thing, but it's critical to think about what you want to do with your 911. I always tell organizations, static is great if you just kind of want to hit it and forget it and not walk away, and walk away from it. But it's probably going to be wrong within the next 15 minutes because someone's going to move somewhere in the organization. So you should always be thinking about how I'm going to deploy a dynamic solution in my environment and what are kind of those gotchas for that dynamic world so that I can ensure 911 gets routed to the right place. A lot of organizations, they just make the assumption that everyone's going to use their cell phone to dial 911. And maybe they're right if your organization was headsets only, right? No one's going to run around with their headset and dial 911 really. That's probably a really low use case, to be honest. But if you do deploy hard set phones and you have physical phones everywhere, well, then 911 becomes more important because people are more likely to pick up that handset and dial 911. So you just have to think about it from that perspective.
And another perspective to even look at is, what happens if you have a mobile client, such as an iPhone or Android device, dialing 911? Microsoft doesn't want that call going through the system if you're already on a cell phone. It's going to say, we're using your actual cell phone service to dial 911, because then when you actually use your cell phone, they're able to triangulate your exact location, using built-in capabilities of your cell phone. So why even bother dealing with a system that may or may not get your location correct, where you could pretty much say this is the location of the cell phone? And it really comes down to that client, kind of like what Richard talked about, kind of what the experience is. The use case of really somebody even utilizing the soft client is very slim to none, but it is still something that somebody might use, or somebody might try to use their cell phone more than anything else.
Right. So let's be really clear what Eric just said. If I dial 911 from the Teams client on iOS or Android, when it goes to make that phone call, it's going to bypass Teams and just go out your Sprint, Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile network and go out that way. So those ones you can kind of check off and not worry too much about off to the side. Is easy way to collect the location. So the client is going to, Teresa's question is, is there an easy way to collect the info about the location? So can you go back? I think it's one slide that has the list of, yeah, right there, perfect. So what you can do from a dynamic perspective is you configure inside of via PowerShell, and I say this subnet 10.0.24, right, is in this location, 10.0.1.0.20, right, and set them from that perspective. The client then simply matches to that higher subnet level. So if you need to go higher than 24, maybe to 16, whatever, you can kind of group more together. So the big thing is just kind of understanding how your subnets are set up. And for some organizations, this becomes like a determining factor for 911 purposes. They may need to resubnet their organization, right? So if I'm in a physical office and I need to buy for regulatory purposes or whatever the case is, here in Minnesota, right, we have to be at the floor level in order for 911 services. So I might need to deploy different, a subnet per floor of my organization so I can clearly say that, this subnet is the 21st floor, this subnet is the 22nd floor, so on and so forth. So sometimes you have to make some of those network decisions then based on your 911 policies.
Yep. And then we have
right.
this question about the 60 common room phones and calling plans.
Yep.
With that, you can take those common area phones and move those to direct routing, but keep your users on calling plans with no issues whatsoever. You're allowed to have a mix between the two in your organization. It's not you just have to have one or the other. No, you can mix those two together. And if you did dial just another user account, you're not actually utilizing the PSTN from that common area phone. You can still do that without any type of drop issues because it's not even, and that's just doing a standard SIP call internally with Microsoft Teams.
Yep. No, so the dial by extension would continue to work from the common area phone, and you would handle that then back at the SBC level, right? So if you think about it, I think it's, can you zip back to that diagram real quick? I think it's like 3 slides back, 4 slides.
Something. Yep.
Yeah. One more. Here we go. All right. So in this instance here, right? So if I've got a common area phone dangling off of my existing PBX, right? Or maybe that common area phone is registered directly to the SBC, either one, right? It doesn't really matter. When that user lifts the handset and they dial extension 1234, the SBC, you would tell the SBC, oh, you see that extension 1234? Great. That's actually translates into this real telephone number. Change that into a real 11-digit telephone number that we know what it is, and then send it off to Teams via direct routing, and then that would ring the user. So the biggest thing you wouldn't get, right, you wouldn't have a true from the common area phone, and there's ways you could do this, but there wouldn't be like a true directory on the phone. Not that I've seen a common area phone do this recently.
I think she's talking about the common area phone, like native Teams common area phones, not like a third party common area phone. I think she's talking about the native one, not like tied to an SBC, because she's already got those common area phones on Teams today.
Oh yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can
still, in either
similar
scenario.
Concept. Yeah,
Yep.
Similar concept. Yeah. Yep. Okay. E-Link Android. Yep. Absolutely. Same concept. You can just route them.
Yep. Awesome. Do we have any other questions about dynamic 911 or static 911 before we move on to and call queue? Chance from anybody? Feel free to come on voice or just send your message in the chat.
All right. I think we're good.
That's it. Good. Awesome. So one of the features that we talked about with Teams Voice was our cloud auto attendants and cloud call queues. What are cloud auto attendants and cloud call queues? If you've ever called an organization and it says, "Hey, thank you for calling Microsoft. Press 1 for support. Press 2 for financial. Press 3." That is your auto attendant. That is what allows the incoming caller to be routed to a different destination, whether that be a user, whether it be a call queue, or even another auto attendant. Perhaps maybe you have press 1 for support, and then press you'll get transferred to another auto attendant to press 1 for support, technical support, or press 2 for customer service, something like that. So cloud auto attendants in general are Microsoft's replacement for the older Exchange Unified Messaging auto attendants. So if anybody here used to utilize Skype for Business Server on premises, or even like a third-party PBX that utilized Exchange UM, the big difference with cloud auto attendants is that it was designed to be a cloud-first application. The Exchange UM was really built on-prem back in 2007 and then was migrated to the cloud. So it really was never really designed for the cloud, but they made it work for the cloud. But in today's world, it is a deprecated product, does not exist anymore unless you are still running an older version of Exchange on premises. One awesome thing with cloud auto attendants compared to the old way of doing things is that you don't have to convert your MP3s or whatever file format you have to a single channel WAV format that may or may not have affected the audio quality of that auto attendant. So now, due to this, you have a lot crisper and better sounding audio with those cloud auto attendants. And we are going to dive into a demo that shows exactly how to set up a auto attendant in call queue. But we at least want to talk about kind of what both features are a little bit in depth before we do that demo. The other thing that we talked about is the cloud call queues. And this is really Microsoft's replacement for the Skype for Business online call queues and the on-premises response groups that may have been around with Skype for Business if you had that in your environment. Cloud call queues are more or less a way to dial into organization and get transferred to a queue. Let's just say you have a support queue. And let's just say you have 3 people in support, but you have 5 incoming callers. Those first 3 calls are going to be able to be answered by all 3 of your support individuals, but those 2 other peoples will, those 2 other people will stay on hold and have whatever hold music you have defined, waiting until somebody becomes available that's part of that group to answer that call. Now, there are different routing types, so you could just, have, it route to an agent inside your organization based on, attendant. Attendant means that no matter if the person's in a call or out of a call, it's going to be ringing their phone and telling them, hey, you have an incoming call coming in. But then there's also serial routing, which allows you to kind of, hey, this person is free, route to him. If this person's not free, move to this person, et cetera. There's a lot of different routing methodologies that we will talk about here momentarily. But just kind of give you a mindset that you can change how these calls route and how they're kept on hold. Again, you have different customizations such as your hold music, business hours available to you. And the business hours are more or less controlled by the auto attendant that would answer first that before transferring to that call queue. But if you just wanted to transfer right into that call queue, you could just assign a number to that call queue and forward it in. And we will talk about that here momentarily. And again, as mentioned, it is used usually together with a auto attendant in your organization. Now, talking about both cloud call queues and auto attendants, if you had a on-premises Skype environment, they are very useful for organizations not moving to Teams overnight, because it works with both on-premises and cloud-based users. So if you had that Skype on-prem environment today, you can utilize those 2 feature sets with your on-premises environment without having to worry about stuff. Now, when you do move those users to the cloud, then there really is not any additional configuration needed because those users are already part of that cloud call queue and already a group of that queue. Now, if you want to enable this feature set, kind of as mentioned before with the licensing, you have to have some license, some form of Microsoft's phone system. So that is the actual call processing piece of Microsoft Teams. So as soon as a single phone system license is added to your tenant, whether it be an EFI or just an individual license, in the Teams Admin Center, you will see the auto tenants and call queues options, and a few others actually even pop up under the voice tab of the Teams Admin Center. And again, as mentioned previously, it works as both Skype server, Skype Online, and Microsoft Teams users all natively. After July of 2021, it may or may not work with your Skype for Business on-premises environment. If you do have that in your organization, just due to the Skype for Business Online shutdown coming in place. We haven't really received word if that's still going to continue to work or not, but do keep that in mind if your organization does have that Skype on-prem solution.
So Dave asked a question, is there any difference between auto attendants and call queues if you're doing calling plans versus direct routing? The answer is no. There's a little bit difference of a configuration in terms of where you get that phone number set up, but beyond that, they're the same.
Yep. And with we'll talk about how the phone number is actually set up with what's called a resource account here. So a resource account, you have to think of it as like a virtual user object that's tied to that individual service. So if you are running Skype on-prem, it requires that those accounts are created on premises. But if you are a Teams only organization, you'll have anything on premises with the Microsoft Voice solution. You can create those right inside the Teams Admin Center and then assign what's called a phone system virtual user license to that object. Those licenses are completely free of charge. You can go provision 250 of them to your tenant today, and it will cost you $0 indefinitely. That is required to at least enable the account as a resource account in Microsoft Teams. Now, that is required whether or not you're using direct routing or a calling plan from Microsoft. So pretty much the only difference, though, between the direct routing and calling plan configuration is where you are assigning that phone number to that resource account. So the phone number is not assigned to that auto attendant or that cloud call queue. It's assigned to that underlying resource account in your organization. So pretty much if you have a calling plan, you're going into the Teams Admin Center saying, I want this phone number assigned to this resource account, done. But if you are using direct routing, that currently today, that has to be done via PowerShell. So you would need to connect the Skype for Business Online PowerShell and then run a set-cs application instance and then set the line URI for that application instance to have that telephone number assigned to it. And then the phone system virtual user license is required in all topologies unless you're using Skype for Business Hybrid with no Teams direct routing, which would also limit a few other feature sets. But really, if you're using Teams, you need that license there. Just kind of keep that as a general mindset.
Yeah, and the reason why you're assigning the phone number to the virtual license, if you want to go, I think it's the demo next, right? Yeah, if you want to start working on that. The reason you want to be able to assign to the phone number to a virtual user is that you can assign multiple virtual users to an auto attendant. So there's a lot of organizations that might have more than a single phone number that answers to an auto attendant. This allows me to take a bunch of accounts, assign all those virtual users to a single user, and then you're set. Teresa asked, is it the line URI or is it the on-prem line URI?
So there is a small difference with the application instances, and this is where, Microsoft naming things. If you're assigning a number to a user, it's the on-prem line URI switch, but if you're doing it to an application instance, it's actually just line URI. Yep. And also the way you import that number in the formatting is even different. So if you're assigning a direct routing number to a user, you're doing on-prem line URI, and then you're putting TEL:+1 and then the 10-digit phone number for that user. With the application instance, you're doing the dash line URI and then just doing +1 and then the 10-digit number. There's differences between the configuration between the two. It's just thanks, Microsoft.
Yeah. It's one of those little things you need to be aware of. That's all.
Exactly. Yep. So we are going to jump into a small demo of the Teams Admin Center and how you actually do configure and build these auto attendants in your organization. So we're going to go ahead and log in as an admin to our Office 365 tenant. And across the bottom left, you're going to go to your Teams Admin Center. And let's just say we're going to go through. We're going to build a dummy auto tenant and a dummy call queue, just so you know how to build that in your organization. So if we go over here to our voice area, you can start building your auto tenant or your call queue, but we want to first do one thing, and that is create those resource accounts that we talked about. So we're going to go to our org-wide settings, and we're going to go down to resource accounts. And I will make this a little bit bigger in case you guys are having trouble seeing the screen. Joys of a 1440p display. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a resource account for both our call queue and our auto attendant. So we're going to click on this add button, and we're going to say this is going to be test AA for test auto attendant. We're going to copy that display name down to our username, and we're going to put the domain as our main domain. Now, in your organization, you will be able to set this, but because this is a hybrid Skype environment, I can't actually set this, unfortunately, for you. So I am going to use just an alternate domain just for the purposes of this demo. And then in this case, we are going to set this to be a auto attendant. And as soon as we click save, that resource account's created, you'll see that pop up here. Now, we're also going to go through and create a test CQ, which was for our test call queue. And we're going to set that as a username and then set the resource account type to call queue and click save. I hope if I actually set the right domain. Okay. So now we're going to go back to our Teams Admin Center and expand our users tab. And we're going to search for test. And you'll see that test AA and that test CQ are now created. So what we're going to do is assign that phone system virtual user license to these two accounts. So we're going to select both accounts, then click manage product licenses, and we can hit replace because we don't really care what else is assigned to them. And then the select location, we're going to make sure that the location of these accounts, so in this case, United States, is selected. And then we're going to select the Microsoft 365 phone system virtual user license and hit save. If you do not have that license available to you, you'll need to go ahead and go to your billing tab, go to purchase services. And in this top right, you're just going to type in phone system. And you'll see that Microsoft 365 phone system virtual user license with a free price available, and just purchase that for your tenant, and you'll have that option. So now that we have those two accounts assigned a phone system virtual user license, we need to go ahead and build our call queue. So we're going to go to our voice tab of the Teams Admin Center, and then go ahead and go down to our auto attendants. And we're going to create one by clicking add, and we're just going to call this test AA. And then you have some options available to you. One of these options is who is an operator. So in the event that somebody needs to talk to somebody else in your organization, maybe they don't like any of the menu options, you can set up 0 to be like an operator organization. And so you can set this either to a person in your organization, a voice application, so that could be another auto attendant or another call queue, or it can even be an external phone number for your organization. So let's just say you want to send it to a third party PBX or something that has your call center enabled in it. You would click that external phone number option. In this case, we're just going to leave this as no operator just for the purposes of this demo. You are asked for your time zone. I'm going to go ahead and hit Central Time. And then you have another option that asks, do you want to enable voice inputs with this auto attendant? This is useful if you want to be able to say Richard Brynteson or Eric Marsi. And if you have on the next page, we'll show you the directory enabled. You can just say that person's name during that auto attendant playing, and you can get transferred to that person's extension directly, whether or not they are a menu option in the auto attendant. So in this case, I am going to turn that on so we can see those features, and we're going to click on next. Now you have, this is where you start beginning to build your call flow. So the first part is playing a greeting message. You can either play an audio file that you pre-recorded using your favorite recording tool, or you can type in a greeting message that you could have, played back to you with a digital voice. And the digital voice actually doesn't sound half that bad, just depending on your organization. If you want like something very specific to your organization, you may want to record, but that voice is not a robotic sounding voice at all. It's kind of, I believe it's based on like the Cortana mindset, if I'm not mistaken.
It is.
So, here you would say, thank you for calling, Microsoft. Please listen carefully, whatever, something like that. Then the route call to, you would want to select something more than just disconnect.
It's my favorite option. It's my favorite option.
I love that option, but
disconnect.
The fun thing with disconnect though is that may still be a need in your organization. You may, press 1 to get transferred here, and then you just play this auto attendant that says, hey, we're closed, whatever, something that matters. Something you may have a use case for that. But more or less, you're going to go ahead and be using the play menu options function. So now the play menu options function is we're going to list off, press 1 for Richard, press 2 for customer support, press 3 for whatever you want to set in your organization. Now you can either, again, do a pre-recorded audio file, or you can type in a greeting message where you would say, press 1 for Richard, press 2 for whoever else. And then down here where it has the set menu options is where you're going to go ahead and assign a dial key. So if I go ahead and hit assign a dial key and hit this drop down, this is where you're going to select 0, 1 through 9. And so let's say mention option number 1, we're going to say, what do you want to redirect that button to when somebody presses that button? So you could say, person in the organization, another resource account. Voicemail for a user is an option. So if you want to just forward that call directly to a person's voicemail, or maybe it's a shared voicemail box, such as like a customer support inquiries or something of that matter, you can set that up. And that's really useful, especially like in an after hours type situation where somebody calls in, maybe you guys are closed. You just want to have all those calls go to voicemail, you can set that here. But in this case, we're just going to say, forward it to a voice app. And I'm actually going to change this word Richard to, call Hugh, just as that one we're going to set up. And then here's where we're going to type in the test CQ and hit search. And then we're going to find that, of course.
You haven't created it yet. Yeah. So this is one of those tricks, right? And you always build from the backwards, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you're building, so if you're gonna, and you can chain these things as deep as you want. There's no limit. So if you wanted to chain and you really didn't like people calling you, you could chain 50, 60 of these together and just keep them, stuck in an infinite loop if you really wanted to. But I always map it out in Visio, and then you kind of work your way from the bottom back up so that when you're building it, you've got all the little pieces that you need to build with.
Now, the other big thing is that account may also not be showing because it hasn't fully provisioned that account inside of Teams yet. So when you assign that Vodafone System virtual user license, there's a provisioning task that has to go through in Microsoft's backend that says this user is part of Teams. It has to be enabled. And that could take, depending on the time of the day, it could take 5 minutes. It could take a couple hours. Teams is very fun when it comes to provisioning.
Yep. Can you go back to voice in the redirect? There was one thing I just want to point out real quick in that drop down. So when you see this voicemail right here, when it says search for an Office 365 group, it's not going to send to a voicemail of a particular user. So in this case, this is where you have that I need a shared voicemail box for a bunch of users. So all you do is you go build a distribution list inside of Office 365, and then you can go search for the distribution list, and it just simply appears as an email for those users. The important thing to note is there is no greeting for that shared mailbox. It's just going to like prompt them to leave a message. So if there's anything you want to prompt ahead of time for that shared mailbox, you really need to do it in the front end on the call queue.
Yep. Awesome. And then the other one that we mentioned before was the voice routing for the directory search. If you don't have that enabled voice prompts enabled on that first page, you will not see this directory search function where you can say dial by name, or you can just say, the person's name, or even the dial by extension function. So in this case, we're just going to press 1. The person in the organization that is already provisioned. We'll come back and we'll change that to the call queue here momentarily. But we're going to go ahead and click on next. Now, this is where things start getting more on the advanced side of your organization, where you can say, okay, do I want this auto attend to be always open? Or during certain business hours, do I want it to do one thing, and then after hours, do I want it to do another thing? So in this case, you could set up, business hours to say, I want, only from 8 a.m. till 5 p.m. I want this auto attend to work. Anything outside of that, I want to do some type of alternate flow. So, right now in this case, we're not going to set up after hours business calls. But here's where you would set up the same exact menu options. So you can say play menu options to do exactly what you did on the previous page. But this is only in effect when you're outside of your organization's business hours. And that really comes down to the needs of your organization. Now, the other thing you could do is what happens during a holiday. So you come in here and you can say, I want, Christmas and all these other things. What happens to those calls during those holidays, and kind of how does that work in your organization? This is where you would build that out. Now, the next tab, which is called Dial Scope, this is where the dial by name directory or the dial by extension directory comes into play, where you can say, do I want all people in my organization to be able to be reached by this auto attendant, or do I want to say just a custom user group in Office 365 is allowed to be reached by this auto attendant? Where this is very useful, especially let's just say put in a case of Microsoft. You do not want Satya Nadella or some of your C-level execs available via an auto tenant, because next thing you know, they're now getting spam calls every day. Somebody wanting to talk to the CEO of the company and voice their concerns. So you want to kind of limit that if that is a warring organization. Most of the times it won't be, but just keep that in mind that you do have that functionality available to you. Now, this last option across the left is resource accounts. This is where we assign that resource account to this auto attendant. Now, what is really cool with Teams is that we can assign multiple resource accounts to this auto attendant. You might be thinking, why is that useful? Well, perhaps maybe you have 4 or 5 different DIDs that need to go to this auto attendant, and you don't want to do it at the carrier level. You can do that right inside of Teams and have all those resource accounts tied directly to this auto attendant. In this case, we just have the one. So we're going to hit add an account, and we're going to type in test, and we should hopefully see test AA. There we are. Awesome. And then we're going to go ahead and click on add. So now you'll see the test AA is added, and we can hit submit. One thing to note is that we have not connected to Skype Online PowerShell and actually set a phone number for this. We're not going to have enough time for that in this demo, but we would do that set CS Online application instance command to actually set that DID. Since we're using this in a scenario. If you're using calling plans, you can do that right inside the Teams Admin Center. So we're going to click submit, and this auto tenant will be created in Microsoft Teams. And if you were to dial that test AA at the T2M Labs on Microsoft.com right now from your Teams or Skype client, you would actually hear this auto tenant we just created via SIP address. So now let's go ahead and create our call queue that we have. We have 20 minutes. So we're going to go ahead and hit add, and we're going to call this test CQ, and we're going to add that resource account that we created earlier. And if we click on that, we can go in here and click on add and add. Now, this is where we're going to set the language of this call queue, and we're going to go ahead and set English United States in this case. And then here's where we can say, I want to have a greeting that says, please stand by, we'll get to you momentarily, whatever. And then you can have it play an audio file or just the default music on hold information. Now, if you have, like a music on hold that already has like, our organization offers this during these months or like something like that, and that music on hold, you don't need to even worry about adding a greeting in that case. That greeting is first dial into the call queue. And then this is where you're going to go ahead and associate different groups with this call queue. So you can either assign individual agents. So you can just say add users. I want these static users to be part of this group. Or you can say, I want everybody in this group to be part of this call queue. Where that is useful is if you have a customer service department that may or may not have a high turnaround of employees. As you add a new employee to your organization, if they're added to that group, they're already part of the call queue. You don't have to go into 15 places just to get that person up and running with the organization. Now, another switch here that we want to talk about is conference mode. And this is kind of a switch that you need to determine if it meets your organization's needs. So if you are running Skype for Business server today, and you want to have that interrupt between your on-prem and your cloud-only users, you do not want to turn this on because it will not work with your on-premises users. But the difference is that when it is off, even though you have that interrupt, it does route calls very much slower compared to what it would be if that switch was on. Now, if you are a Teams only organization, I don't have anything on-prem, your Teams only, definitely switch this to on position just so that the calls get connected faster, and it's a much more modern experience for connecting that calls to those agents. So
it's a good 2 to 3 seconds faster to connect a call. Yeah. Like it is dramatically different.
Yep. And we do switch it to on, you'll see it, Skype Business Client will not be able to receive calls when this is enabled. Now, this is where we get into our routing methodology, and you can kind of look at these, and from Microsoft's side, to kind of determine which one best fits your organization. A tenant, no matter your presence, it's going to send that call to that user. And just depending on what you need, those options are set right here. Now, another option is the presence-based routing. So this is kind of an add-on to that routing methodology. So if you had a tenant enabled, we'll just say, I want presence-based routing and I want to use this in a modern Teams-only environment. That pretty much will say if this person's do not disturb or something of that matter, it's still not going to route that call to them just to make sure that they're not getting interrupted from whatever they are doing. And then also you have a toggle here that allows you to have an agent be able to opt out from taking a call. So if you want that agent, you say, hey, I'm taking a week, off, I'm doing like something else this week, I'm not doing call center. You want to be able to have that agent be able to opt out of getting those calls. Say they're going to like a training session, you don't want them getting interrupted all day. But most scenarios, if you are using this, you do want to keep that off so that way somebody's not removing themselves from the call queue and then then in fact not doing their job in that scenario. But it really comes down to the use case. Now, the alerting time is how long that call queue is going to go ahead and alert somebody for that call. So this is each time it tries to call that individual agent of that call queue, it's going to say, hey, you have a call. Hey, you have a call. But it's only lasts for a certain period of time. By default, this is 30 seconds. You can then set your maximum people you can have in the queue. So maybe if you have more than 50 people, you don't want to have 50 people sitting on hold. You can just have them either disconnected or redirect those extra calls to a person, a call queue, a voicemail group, you name it. Now, the maximum wait time as it stands is how long do you want people to sit in that queue before they're either disconnected or routed to a voicemail or something else in the organization. You would set that here. In this case, we're just going to kind of leave this as defaults, and I am just going to add one user here real quick. Just to at least get this created. And we added it 3 times. There we go. There we go. So add it in, we have one user, and we're going to click on save. Now, this is where Richard's statement on building backwards into Teams kind of comes in effect, because if we would have built this first before building an auto tenant, we wouldn't have to go back to our auto tenant and now reconfigure that button to say it needs to go to a call queue. So in this case, we're going to go into our auto tenant, go to our call flow, and say this needs to now go to a voice app, and we're going to search for test, and hopefully that provisioned fully. And there we are. Now we'll see test CQ. And now when we press 1 of this auto tenant, it's going to forward to that call queue that we just created. Now, just so we have enough time to kind of get it through everything, we are going to hop back to our presentation, and we'll kind of take questions at the end regarding the auto tenants and cloud call queues. So we're going to go ahead and jump into call routing, and I'll let Richard kind of go into this.
So yeah, I'm going to just buzz through these slides real quick, just so that I always like to tell people that the Teams is built on the success of Skype for Business. So there's a lot of stuff in Office 365 that still utilizes Skype for Business, and the entire calling infrastructure still routes through that Skype for Business environment. So a lot of people think that it's like net new, and it really isn't. Skype for Business Online was built inside of the next gen data center, so it's still utilizing a lot of those things. The next slide here, just because I think it's funny. When you make a phone call, these are all the decisions that are made about a telephone call. And I will not go through this flow chart because it's very entertaining, but you will have access to this PowerPoint slide. And I find it is kind of interesting to kind of just zoom in on this and kind of look at the moving pieces that are all happening as part of a call, because as you can tell, there are a lot of them. So it's more of a reference kind of thing, and just, entertainment for myself.
And we'll briefly touch on network optimization and kind of then get into our devices before we run out of time. So Microsoft's global network is vast. It's built across the entire globe. But one of the big things with Teams is that we want to get people into Microsoft's data center as quick as possible. And that is kind of, if you have, multiple sites, you want to get those sites each connected to Microsoft, the nearest try to think of the connection point to Microsoft Teams. So if we look at this, we have our kind of our service front doors and kind of getting that connected into Microsoft Teams and Microsoft's 365 services. So pretty much that network POP, that is your point where your users are connecting to Microsoft. And this is based on DNS. I can't remember. It's like, I believe it's Anycast DNS, to be able to determine that nearest peering point. So that you can get to Microsoft as quick as you can through your ISP. Once you're into Microsoft's network, it then goes through the service front door, and then that service front door is kind of like your Skype, your Teams, your Exchange area, and those services connect to the data that's also stored in Microsoft's cloud. The best way to think about this is really an organization. If you're using like a shared internet connectivity model where you have maybe multiple sites sharing one ISP, you want to kind of start moving away from that where each site has its own ISP connectivity if you are using Teams. Because if you're backhauling all that data back to your headquarters, well, now this user in Arizona is going all the way to Ohio just to get to the internet, and now their call quality is going to be suffering because they're going all the way across all these different points.
And the key element there, and this is important, you might have, in Eric's example, maybe you have a local egress for the internet in Arizona, but the problem was when that person did their DNS lookup, that DNS lookup for, their local POP, it would have, if you're using Azure AD integrated or something like that, it may have backhauled all the way back to Ohio, done that DNS lookup in Ohio, returned it to the client and said, hey, your nearest network POP is back in Ohio. So you still might go out your local egress, but then still have to go all the way back to Ohio. So you really have to think about how DNS functions in your organization and make sure that you're retrieving local DNS records for these Teams services or these Azure function services.
Correct. Okay. So some traffic considerations you do want to look at, again, is, do you want to make sure that you're not really doing that centralized internet traffic or, having those DNS lookups go elsewhere rather than that local site. There are some bandwidth requirements that you have in different scenarios when using Microsoft Teams. So these are the numbers provided by Microsoft per call. So you can look at that bandwidth up and down, the requirements per, peer-to-peer HD quality video, that's 720p, 30 frames a second. Quick question, Richard, is the 720p video limitation still in effect with Teams since COVID? Okay,
yep,
cool.
It is.
Yep. So right now today, you're not going to see that 1.5 megabit a second utilization because Microsoft did cut down the video quality to just 720p to save on bandwidth due to COVID in March of this past year. One way to determine what your network requirements are is using the network planner inside the Teams admin center. So pretty much inserting like your site's information, bandwidth requirements, and then it can kind of give you back a report that says, here's exactly everything you need per site in your organization. When you're looking at the traffic itself, you want to make sure that you're bypassing any type of proxy that you may have, because proxies usually only allow TCP traffic out, which in voice or video or anything, having TCP traffic is bad because that's going to add a lot of latency and potentially cause a lot of quality issues with your experience. And then also you want to make sure you have QoS enabled, internally and all the way out to your provider. Also, if you are using a VPN, especially in today's remote workforce, you want to make sure that you are using a split tunnel methodology. So that way, if your users are all geographically dispersed, their site-to-site traffic that's going for your organization is going across a VPN tunnel, but stuff destined for Office 365 that needs to be going out their local egress point, so their local internet connection to be able to find out, where should they route to next. And this is really big, especially in some organizations that may have strict security where they want full tunnel no matter what. And that full tunnel, if you're not trusting Microsoft's own IP at list, are you really trusting even Office 365 in that service? So really think about that for your organization. I mean, you want to split all Microsoft 365 bound traffic off of that VPN. Also, a big one is ISP routing. So if you have an ISP, do a trace route and see how many hops you're going through to get to Microsoft's peering point. There's been cases where some ISPs are, sending you traffic, even if you have the correct peering point, coming back to you, it could be sending out to New York and then this state and this state and this state and just kind of doing all these hops. You want to make sure that you're not, the ISP is not suboptimally routing your traffic. So now the part that everybody looks forward to is the talk about devices in Microsoft Teams. So the first one we're going to talk about is our native phones to Microsoft Teams. So these are new phones that Microsoft released that run Android and run the full Microsoft Teams application experience minus the actual Teams functionality and chat. And this just really allows you to have a native contact list, a native calendar management, one-touch join for your meetings. So you can easily say, here's my calendar, I want to join this meeting. Bam, you're in the meeting with that phone. And you also have a fully functional meeting experience. There are no limitations when you're using that phone. You also have the ability to look at voicemail transcription. So if you get a voicemail, you don't even want to listen to it, you just click on that voicemail on your phone, you can see that transcription of that in text form. Now, with these devices, they are managed fully in the Teams Admin Center. Some vendors have their own additional solution, like AudioCodes has their OVOX solution, and it really depends on the phone vendor on what type of management solution you can have in addition to Microsoft platform. But most of the things you need to worry about are already done inside the Teams Admin Center. And there's multiple vendors out there. There's AudioCodes, there's Crestron, there's Poly, there's Yealink. There's multiple phones in every use case that you might have in your organization. And Microsoft is bringing new, cheaper devices to market, because that was one of the bigger complaints about the native phones is that, hey, I don't want to be spending $300 to $700 on a phone for a common area phone. So they are bringing cheaper options. I believe it was the $100 mark or whatever, later to Microsoft Teams. Now, the other type of device that we mentioned before is our legacy 3-pip devices. So these are devices that were certified for Skype for Business, do not run a native Teams firmware, but are running firmwares that are built by the actual device manufacturer, such as Polycom or AudioCodes. So these devices do work with Teams today, but they have very limited functionality. So the original planned date for these devices to stop working was July 31st, 2023. But later this year, they announced that they would be extending that to an unknown date. The date I still like putting out there, though, is July 31st, 2023, because there is a chance that date could change or even still be that day. We don't know yet. But just kind of keep that in mind that those devices will work till 2023. Now, when 3-pip is end of life, when Microsoft does kill off those services that work with those phones and allow them to interact with Teams, those devices can usually switch to just standard generic SIP mode. So this is, if you're using like a Mitel or a free PBX solution, you can still use those phones with the standard SIP service. And Microsoft will soon allow you, and I believe it's end of Q1, early Q2 next year, they're going to allow you to register those directly to Teams. But the only thing you're going to have on those is basic call in, call out, nothing else. You're not going to have calendar or anything. It's just becoming a basic SIP endpoint. Where this is useful is if your organization has fax machines or something else that utilizes the legacy, just the standard SIP service, you can tie those directly to Microsoft Teams beginning next year. This is also useful for organizations that maybe have Skype for Business on-prem but don't want to expend the money on the devices currently to move to Teams. It allows them to move to Teams but also still have a lot of the features. Now, what type of function limitations are you looking forward to if you have one of these devices? Big one, you have no voicemail / message waiting indicator notifications. MWI is kind of a limitation of not having that as a limitation of the cloud voicemail service, not really Teams in general. It's just a limitation of that service itself. But we can go ahead and list of all your voicemails. Now you can still dial into the voicemail service from the phone by clicking your voicemail button and clicking Message Center, but you won't actually have that digital voicemail function. Also, presence information is not duplicated to these devices. So you do not, if you said do not disturb or say available busy, that does not get changed in Teams. Even if you set it on the device, it'll quickly revert back if you set that. Also, if you set any type of forwarding option on the phone, it does not set them in Teams, and it does not work at all. You can join Teams meetings from these devices, but it is limited in terms of feature set. It's pretty much going to be able to join in, listen in. You can talk into the audio conference. That's it. There really isn't like a remove, be able to remove people. There's not really that conference control like you have with Skype for Business. The other big one is that you do not have any form of a personal contacts list or speed dial. Now, this is more or less coming down to how you got to Teams. If you are on Skype for Business server and you went ahead and migrated your account to Microsoft Teams, you're still going to have a contacts list in there, and that's going to be your contacts list that you had from Skype for Business. But that list will never change. That is pretty much there. It will not change. You could set your contacts in Teams all day. It's not going to change that list. If you are a brand new user to Teams, you're not going to have any contacts whatsoever, and there is no way to add those unless you went back to Skype for Business, added them in, they kind of went back to Teams, but I don't recommend that at all. Now, some phones do have speed dial functions available on them. So like, audio codes or even Polycom have different sidecar modules. You can add speed dials, or even just natively on the phone, you can create speed dials in the web UI for the phone. So those will still work, but they're not going to have any of the presence information like you would have when they were in Skype for Business mode. Now, certain partners offer a trade-up program that allows you to you trade the devices into that partner and then get the devices, newer devices back at a cheaper rate. So that way you can move to Teams, but not have to, break the bank as much moving to those newer devices. Now, the last thing we want to talk about real quick.
Hey, Eric, let's kill the last two slides since there's 4 minutes left.
Yep. Cool.
And I know Teresa's got to give away a prize. So.
Yep. I'll let her go and go from there.
Yeah. So if you have questions, go ahead and feel free to throw them in the chat, or we can answer them as soon as a prize is given away.
Awesome.
Are you still there, Teresa?
I am. I was just trying to get a word in here because you guys have been going at such a great movement here. I love it. I learned a lot personally, so I personally thank you. So a little bit of housekeeping, guys. We have a session at noon for the top 10 things to know from Ignite. So please join that. Also, again, we're doing a random drawing for each session. So today, for this particular session, Teresa Vanda, you have won the $25 gift card. I have your email address, so we will be getting that out to you. Guys, I want to thank you. The recording will be available on our website. So thank you, and everyone enjoy the next session. And Richard and Eric, I'm going to turn it back to you in case there's some questions.
Yeah, so Dave's question, what happens if a call comes in on a Teams while I'm in a Teams meeting? So that call is just going to toaster pop in, and your meeting will continue to go on unless you go and answer the call. If you answer another call, then your Teams meeting will go on hold. You can take that other call, and as soon as you hang up, you do have to go resume the call so that you can get back into the meeting. Jody asked about any word on text messaging capability. So there's nothing native at this point in time. There are a lot of direct routing partners, though, on the other hand, that do text messaging through the direct routing service. So Microsoft doesn't have it native through a calling plan, but you can go to those other direct routing providers, and they have text messaging, and then they have text messaging apps that you can load into Teams. So you get that SMS feature functionality set just through that direct routing partner then. So Microsoft hasn't made any announcements in that, and I haven't seen anything either, honestly.
Yep. And then I did throw in a link to my blog that kind of goes ahead and talks over the feature limitations of the 3-pip devices if you do have any other questions. And this is just pretty much for me testing out every single feature that I could test out on the phone. So if you do want to read more into that, I did put that link in the chat there for you as well.
Perfect. Cool.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Otherwise, I know the Canadians are about to start talking, so I don't want to keep you away from the Canadians. It's kind of like Minnesota, just a few more A's.
Thank you guys for your time today.
Bye.
Bye.